It's now my honor to introduce our speaker this afternoon. And this is, for me, one of those sort of awkward moments where you are trying to introduce someone that almost everyone in the room knows, and someone who has made such important contributions to the field of Kierkegaard studies, to all of you in your reading and your study. So she is one of those figures that, as we began thinking about this conference, it was the statement that you cannot do a conference on Kierkegaard without Sylvia Walsh. She is scholar in residence in the Department of Philosophy at Stetson University, where she teaches courses on history of Western philosophy, philosophy of religion, feminist philosophy, and feminist ethics. Among her books are Living Poetically, Kierkegaard's Existential Aesthetics, Living Christianly, Kierkegaard's Dialectic of Christian Experience, and Kierkegaard Thinking Christianly in an Existential Mode. She and her husband, Bob, have also just been wonderfully gracious participants in this conference and wonderful to be around. The title of her talk this afternoon is On Becoming a Person of Character. Would you please join me in welcoming Sylvia Walsh?
Thank you very much, Jason. I want to thank Baylor University for inviting me. This is my first trip to the campus, and it's been a wonderful experience. By the way, I'm now retired. I'm no longer teaching, but on this special occasion, honoring the bicentennial of Soren Kierkegaard's birth, it is especially fitting that we should consider whether Kierkegaard, who was first and foremost a Christian thinker, is a Christian thinker for our time. In posing this question, however, it should be noted that there is often a difference between what an age demands and what it needs, as Kierkegaard himself frequently pointed out. It may well be that his understanding of Christianity is not in step with the way it is viewed and practiced today. Yet a strong dose of Kierkegaardian reflection on what it means to become and continue to be a Christian may be precisely what is needed if the expression of Christianity in our time is to be authentic and true to the Christian gospel. What I have chosen to address in this regard is what it means to become a person of character, particularly a person of Christian character, as that, I believe, is a fundamental concern in Kierkegaard's thought. Although character is not a term that appears very often in Kierkegaard's writings, one could justifiably claim that many, if not all, of his works are concerned in one way or another with the concept and analysis of human character. From the very beginning of his literary endeavors, Kierkegaard engages in a character analysis of a kaleidoscope of personalities in the form of representative figures, many drawn from classical and biblical literature, others imaginary constructions of his own or his pseudonyms, who are themselves imaginary constructions, and still others who were actual persons. This array of literary figures and personae populating Kierkegaard's writings from early to late indicate that the typical way he goes about reflecting on character in human existence is through the use of characters who exemplify in some aspect of human character or the lack of it. Yet there is little direct discussion of the concept of character in Kierkegaard's published writings. Two Ages, a literary review, is the only work in which he engages in any explicit discussion of it. Even here, he addresses it somewhat indirectly by showing how the anonymous author of the novel under review illumines the lack of character in the modern age in contrast to the constancy of character in the age of the French Revolution, through a depiction of the domestic life of the characters in the novel, who are typical reflections of the ages in which they live, emphasizing the importance of psychological motivation, environmental influences, and the distinctive character of an age for determining the particular direction the development of individual character will take in it. Kierkegaard conducts a character analysis of the main figures in the novel in order to show how they are affected, for better or worse, by the formative influences of their imaginative lives. Although each character, in his or her own way, reflects the age in which he or she lives, the lack of character in the modern age is represented most admirably and masterfully, Kierkegaard suggests, by a feminine figure who is characterized as being passionless, superficial, ostentatious, conceited, gaudy, inane, ambivalent, philandering, prudentially shrewd, unstable, and concerned only with affectation or appearances. A more damning description of the modern age could hardly be imagined. The important question for us, however, is whether the charge of a lack of character also pertains to our age, and if so, how we may become persons of character in the context of our time. Let us begin by considering what character consists in and how it is formed in this work. Defining the term etymologically from the Greek chorasso, meaning something engraved, Kierkegaard identifies character with inwardness and morality, neither of which is characteristic of the modern age, he thinks, because it lacks passion, decision, and action due to the dominance of prudential reflection, indolence, and envy or selfishness in both individuals and society. Being neither moral nor immoral, individuals make no real distinction between good and evil, the one being just as good as the other. Personal relations are caught up in the tension of a mutual envy or selfishness that establishes itself as the negatively unifying principle of the age, in characterlessness, which takes the form of leveling in the subordination of the individual to the abstraction and mathematical equality of the crowd. Characterless envy is thus not merely personal in nature, but also a public or social phenomenon in which sociality itself becomes a consuming, demoralizing principle that has its basis in a disregard for the separation of the religious individual before God, as Kierkegaard sees it. For him, then, the only way to halt this destructive phenomenon, which is, in his opinion, is here to stay, is to resist it on a personal basis by gaining the intrepidity and essentiality of religiousness. Every individual, male and female alike, is thus encouraged to make the inspired leap of religiousness into the embrace of the eternal in a passionate, personal relation to God, through which one may become a person of character in the full sense of equality as a separate individual in spiritual equality with all persons before God. Now, as Kierkegaard narrows the focus of his thought to a determination of what it means to be a Christian in the specifically Christian writings of the second authorship, the concept of character acquires increasing importance for him, especially in the journals from 1848 to 54. He continues to lament the lack of character in the modern age, which in his view has abolished Christianity as well as character, and the upbringing or character education required for being a person of character. Persons of character, he observes, are even rarer than geniuses or persons of talent, except that even the simplest person can be a person of character. What needs to be brought forth, then, is not knowledge or ideas, but character, especially Christian character, inasmuch as, quote, nowadays no one is a Christian in character, end quote. To step forth existentially in character, to enter into and carry through a character role, to walk in character according to the good, the noble, the altruistic, to become a person of character in the strictest sense, that is, to serve the essentially Christian in character, to live in character according to the essentially Christian or in the character of the essentially Christian, are typical expressions of what Kierkegaard now sees as being sorely needed in his time. Although he does not explicitly identify Christian character with authentic character, the latter is ascribed to a person who, like an apostle or a truth witness, is willing to expose him or herself to danger under his or her own name, not anonymously as a coward would do, and thus to become a figure of disgrace in the world, since in Kierkegaard's view, any action that expresses personal integrity never makes a hit at the time, but is offensive to people. Christianity itself is now characterized as a character task, inasmuch as what it seeks to bring about in a person is a qualitative transformation like the one from non-being to being at birth, namely a total character transformation in time, based on the paradox of rebirth and requiring strenuous effort on the part of those who are transformed. Noting a shift from the intensive to the extensive in the proclamation of Christianity in his day, Kierkegaard maintains that a complete world change took place when attention was diverted from inward deepening leading to the development of character and directed instead to external changes, with the result that, quote, Christianity hardly exists anymore, end quote. Faith is also seen as a character task and a battle of character, rather than a battle of thought with doubt in its conflict with the world. Human vanity wants to obey only what it can comprehend, whereas the person of faith, quote, is a person of character who grasps it as a character task, not to insist upon comprehending, but to believe what one cannot comprehend in unconditional obedience to God. Accordingly, one of the ways character is defined in the late journals is to identify it with obedience, which in Kierkegaard's view has also disappeared from the world, thereby explaining the absence of character. Character is also identified with continuity in the sense of keeping in character after one has won something, like a point in reflection. Unfortunately, in this journal entry, however, character is associated in a sexist manner with man, who in Kierkegaard's opinion is more essentially character than woman, a weak creature who is supposedly overpowered by reflection and cannot maintain it without stumbling or taking a deep breath. The same sexist association appears in For Self-Examination, where he suggests that woman's character is defined by the crucial quality required of every woman that she possess the art of making a house a home, whereas man's character is to be a person of character. Although Kierkegaard presumably intends this characterization of woman to be a compliment to her, it nevertheless reflects a patriarchal perspective that is not only inconsistent with the spiritual equality of the sexes espoused elsewhere in his writings, but also, of course, outmoded and widely unacceptable in Western societies today, where many women work outside the home and are regarded as intellectually and morally equal to men in their capacity to become persons of character. Elsewhere in the journals, Kierkegaard identifies character with service to the unconditioned, which in Kierkegaard's view is the only possible proof that the unconditioned truth that one proclaims is from God. And finally, with the claim in an occasional discourse that the purity of heart is to will one thing, namely the good, which is unconditionally the one and only thing that a person may will, and shall will, and is only one thing, character is also identified with being only one thing, which is then further equated with the infinite, inasmuch as one can be and do many things in the finite realm, whereas infinitely one can only be one thing, or to be only one thing is to be infinite. And this is character, Kierkegaard asserts, going on to state once again that both character and Christianity have been abolished. From Kierkegaard's later journals, then, it is clear that the concept of character acquires increasing importance in his mature thought, especially in his construal of Christianity. But exactly how does one become a person of character in Christianity? And what is the content of Christian character for Kierkegaard? It has been suggested by some commentators that Kierkegaard belongs, broadly speaking, to the classical tradition of virtue ethics and has much to contribute to its renaissance in contemporary moral psychology, philosophy, and theology. Virtue is often associated with character and sometimes even identified with it. There are several considerations, however, that should give us pause in equating character with virtue in Kierkegaard's thought, and in viewing him as a virtue ethicist in continuity with the classical tradition. First of all, virtue is not a term that appears very often in Kierkegaard's writings, and most of the references to it occur in a single work, The Concept of Irony, where he examines the unity of virtue and whether it can be taught in Plato's Protagoras, and opposes Hegel's characterization of Socrates as the founder of morality and a paragon of virtue. A clearer idea of where Kierkegaard himself stands on virtue can be seen in 18 Upbuilding Discourses, where a number of qualities traditionally regarded as virtues are discussed, namely faith, hope, love, joy, courage, meekness, patience, bold confidence, gentleness, faithfulness, kindness, continence, justice, and gratitude or thankfulness. Although Kierkegaard certainly regards these qualities as important inner goods that are needed for the spiritual edification of the single individual, he does not call any of them a virtue, which is surely a conscious decision on his part. In fact, virtue is mentioned only 5 times in the whole text, and in one instance is associated with sagacity or prudence, which in Kierkegaard's view, quote, would first have to be completely altered so as to be used against itself in seeking the good. But since this work is one of the main texts in which the claim that Kierkegaard is a virtue ethicist is based, let us look a little more closely to his treatment of these spiritual qualities, to use a neutral term that does not prejudge them as virtues. Several points stand out. First and foremost is the constant reminder that they are good and perfect gifts from God, who as the good itself, not only gives everything to human beings, but also gives himself with them. Unlike the classical moral virtues of Plato and Aristotle, then, these qualities are not achieved autonomously by human agency. Although a willing, repentant, and thankful receptivity toward God's gifts is required, the single individual can do nothing without the help of God, as even the condition for accepting God's gifts comes from him. While growth and sanctification in the good are possible through the constant acquisition of these spiritual qualities, which are perfect in themselves inasmuch as they come from God, the highest perfection of a human being consists in understanding that one is capable of doing nothing at all by oneself, and thus of one's increasing need of God, who takes neither our imperfections nor our perfections into account in forgiving sin. Far from suggesting that we can attain the good on our own, then, Kierkegaard emphasizes divine agency and a total reliance on the grace of God for the gift of spiritual goods, although constant activity on our part as servants and co-workers of God is also required, inasmuch as for him, quote, everything spiritual is appropriated only in freedom, end quote. A second reason why it is problematic to call Kierkegaard a virtue ethicist is suggested by the process of ethical religious development in concluding unscientific postscript, where human striving does not culminate in the achievement of a virtuous personality, but just the opposite, namely, an increasing realization of our inability to bring ourselves into conformity with the good. According to Johannes Climacus, the ethical religious task, ideally defined, is simultaneously to relate oneself absolutely to eternal happiness as the highest good and relatively to finite ends. Since our immediate existence is rooted in finitude, however, we cannot perform this task at once, but must begin by renouncing finite ends for the sake of the absolute, a task that is never finished. For as soon as we have done it once, we must do it again and again, which gives rise then to inner suffering and a consciousness of guilt over our inability to transform ourselves absolutely so as to bring our lives into conformity with the absolute good or God. Even the slightest single guilt is enough to establish the totality of guilt as a qualitative category in relation to the divine. Thus, instead of moving forward in realizing the ideal task, the ethical religious individual moves backward, inasmuch as, quote, the more he acting, striving, immerses himself in existence, the further he is from the task in the task, end quote. Although one now stands as far as possible away from fulfilling the ideal task, one is still related to it through the consciousness of guilt, which inversely constitutes the expression for a relation to God in the form of a misrelation, yet not so decisively as to cause a break in the essential identity of the ethical religious individual, who remains within an immanent relation to the divine on the assumption that every human being viewed essentially participates in the divine and ultimately will enjoy eternal happiness. The net result, then, of ethical striving in this form of religiousness, which Climacus calls religiousness A, is humorous, inasmuch as the person who does not strive to transform his or her existence gets just as far as the individual who spends his entire life trying to bring his existence into conformity with the eternal and fails. What begins in ethical optimism that one can accomplish the ideal task thus ends in an utter failure to transform oneself, making it highly questionable whether this analysis of natural or immanent religiousness can be said to support an ethics of virtue. As Climacus sees it, this sense of failure is heightened and sharpened in religiousness B, or Christianity, by the introduction of dialectical factors entailing a complete break with immanence on the part of the believer. The religious individual is now revealed to be a sinner who has entirely lost the eternal by his or her own act, and thus is totally incapable of achieving eternal happiness autonomously. Eternal happiness itself is now decided in time via a relation to the eternal in time, which paradoxically has entered into the temporal realm in the form of an individual human being in order to reestablish human kinship with the divine. Not being a Christian himself, Climacus does not spell out the forms of religious pathos associated with Christian inwardness or subjectivity, namely the consciousness of sin, the possibility of offense, and the pain of sympathy for non-believers, leaving these and other decisive categories of Christianity to Kierkegaard and his Christian pseudonym Anti-Climacus to delineate. It thus remains to be seen how they figure into the formation of Christian character in Kierkegaard's later writings. A third and final reason why Kierkegaard should not be considered a virtue ethicist is suggested by a crucial passage in The Sickness Unto Death. Quote, "Very often it is overlooked that the opposite of sin is by no means virtue. In part, this is a pagan view, which is satisfied with a merely human criterion and simply does not know what sin is, that all sin is before God. No, the opposite of sin is faith. As it says in Romans 14:23, whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. And this is one of the most decisive definitions for all Christianity, that the opposite of sin is not virtue, but faith." Scholars who construe Kierkegaard as a virtue ethicist in continuity with the classical tradition tend to make light of this passage, either ignoring its implication for his relation to that tradition, or else viewing it as opposing pagan virtue but not Christian virtue, which is acquired through the grace of God. The latter suggestion, I think, is unlikely, however, given the basically Lutheran structure of Kierkegaard's theology and his agreement with Luther against Aristotle and medieval scholasticism that it is not through a virtuous life, good works, and the like that one attains faith and becomes a good person. Rather, one becomes a good person and does good works through faith, which comes first as the gift of grace through the atonement of Christ. But Anticlimacus clearly does have classical pagan virtue, at least partly in mind, he says in part up there, in the passage quoted above. Christianity is contrasted to classical paganism at several points in the text, and the view of the Church Fathers, usually attributed to St. Augustine, that the virtues of the pagans were glittering vices, is cited with approval, thus in agreement with the Augustinian and Lutheran critique of classical paganism. Yet paganism is a much broader category for Kierkegaard, encompassing all of those within modern Christendom who call themselves Christians but actually live within pagan conceptions. The basic opposition for him, then, is between Christianity and paganism, ungodliness, or spiritlessness in all of its forms, although in his view there is a qualitative difference between classical paganism, which lacked spirit but was moving toward it, and the falling away from spirit that characterized the spiritless paganism of modern Christendom. If becoming a person of character is not equivalent to becoming virtuous for Kierkegaard, as I have suggested above, what then is the content of character in Christianity, and how is it formed? As Kierkegaard understands it, Christianity seeks to bring about a spiritual transformation in every human being, making it possible for us to become persons of character on the basis of a fundamentally different understanding of what it means to be a human self from that of natural, merely human, or pagan, of the pagan mentality, according to which humanity is its own measure of selfhood. What distinguishes Christianity is the fact that a Christian is conscious of existing directly before God as the power that not only establishes the human self, but also constitutes its qualitative criterion and ethical goal or character. Two inversely related qualifications follow from having God as the standard of human selfhood and character. On the one hand, the human self gains an infinite reality as a theological self or human self in relation, in likeness to God. A reality that is so high and extraordinary that it is beyond human comprehension, thus presenting the possibility of offense to the finite human mentality. From a Christian standpoint, however, this infinite self constitutes our true or ideal self and character, which is gained only through a relation to God. On the other hand, Inasmuch as our lives do not reflect the infinite quality and ethical goal of the eternal, in actuality, we exist before God as sinners in willful disobedience of the divine. An infinite qualitative difference is thus posited between a human being and God, inasmuch as, according to Anticlimacus, sin is the one and only predication about a human being that in no way can be stated of God. Christianly understood, then, the fundamental relation between a human being and God is this: a human being is a sinner, and God is the Holy One, before whom we are never pure, always without excuse, and therefore always guilty. Human likeness to the divine is thus qualified so as to bear only an inverse resemblance, not a direct likeness or analogy of being between them. Quote, "Not by the steps of direct resemblance, great, greater, greatest, do you arrive at the possibility of comparison. It is only possible inversely, nor is it by more and more lifting up his head that a human being draws increasingly close to God, but inversely, by casting himself down deeper and deeper in worship." As Kierkegaard sees it, Christianity is characterized throughout by an inverse dialectic in which the essentially Christian is always the positive, which is recognizable by the negative. It thus begins with the teaching that you and I, each and every one of us, is a sinner, which for him is what most decisively differentiates it from paganism. The first condition for becoming a person of character in Christianity, therefore, is to become conscious of oneself as a sinner who is nothing and can do nothing apart from God. The consciousness of sin, however, is a dialectical qualification that may lead one further away from God in the continuation and intensification of sin in despair and offense, as described in the sickness unto death. Or it may bring one closer to God in becoming a contrite or anguished conscience that seeks divine forgiveness, which then establishes a further chasmal qualitative abyss, that's a quote, chasmal qualitative abyss between the human and the divine, inasmuch as, again, according to Anticlimacus, there is one way in which the human being could never in all eternity come to be like God in forgiving sins. Nowhere is the infinite greatness of God more evident to Kierkegaard than in the divine mercy and boundless love shown to a human being in the forgiveness of sin, reconciliation with God, and newness of life made possible by the incarnation and atonement of Jesus Christ, who not only presents the possibility of offense to the human mentality by the qualitative contradiction of his divine human character, but also constitutes a living prototype of the, quote, staggering reality the human self essentially has before God. Humbling himself in the lowly form of a servant, Christ came into the world with the express purpose of suffering for others, thereby learning unconditional obedience to the will of God, even unto death on the cross. While there remains an eternal chasmic abyss between his suffering and ours, especially with regard to the atonement for human sin, which only Christ, being without sin, could accomplish in our stead, the principle that holds with respect to becoming a disciple or follower of Christ for Kierkegaard is this, quote, "As was the prototype, so must the imitation be, also be," end quote. Taking his cue from Matthew 16:24, Kierkegaard understands this to mean that one must deny oneself, walk the same road Christ walked in the lowly form of a servant, indigent, forsaken, mocked, not loving the world, and not loved by it, end quote. Consequently, no one can become or be a Christian except in the character of a lowly person. Although Christ lived in actual earthly lowliness, which constituted the most profound incognito of his divine character, Kierkegaard maintains, however, that Christianity has never equated literal lowliness with being a Christian. The character of lowliness required by the gospel, then, is essentially internal rather than external, a posture or way of existing in relation to others, irrespective of whether one is literally lowly or eminent. The lowly Christian does not exist essentially in lowliness, Kierkegaard explains, because, quote, essentially he is and wants to be himself before God, end quote. Just as Christ was lowly and lofty then, Christian lowliness is twofold in character, inversely signifying at the same time one's infinite loftiness as a human being before God, although not higher than others. Lowliness is thus a disguise or incognito, like that of Christ, that hides one's true character as a Christian. Yet, literal lowliness is not an unfortunate introduction to becoming a Christian, Kierkegaard contends, inasmuch as the possession of external advantages is a detour that requires us to watch ourselves all the more carefully, scrupulously, since the essentially Christian is voluntarily to give up everything in order to follow Christ. But again, he states, quote, I do not know that it is anywhere unconditionally required of a person that in order to be a Christian and in order to be blessed, he must in the literal sense leave everything, or indeed that he must even sacrifice his life, be put to death for the sake of Christianity, end quote. But there is one thing, as Kierkegaard sees it, that is unconditionally required by God, namely honesty, since dishonesty is the one sin that makes grace impossible, while the person who honestly and humbly admits before God that he or she has not literally left everything receives the same grace as the one who does. Essential to the imitation of Christ, however, is the requirement that one die to the world in voluntary self-denial and suffering in likeness to him. In line with the Apostle Paul's conviction that, quote, suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, end quote, Romans 5:3. The Christian is weaned from the world and the things of the world by being enrolled in the school of sufferings, where one is educated for eternity by enduring spiritual trials and learning unconditional obedience to God like Christ. Recognizing that no one is naturally drawn to suffering and abasement, Kierkegaard contends that the most profound change must take place in a person in order to be able to choose and endure specifically Christian suffering, which is distinguished from the ordinary sufferings of life in being voluntarily incurred for the sake of following Christ. Although Christian suffering is lifelong and becomes harder and harder along the way, there are numerous occasions for joy in following Christ. The supreme joy for Kierkegaard being that one is able to become the highest, which every human being can do. Moreover, the heavy burdens of suffering, including the heaviest burden of all, namely the consciousness of sin, are borne lightly in learning in response to the forgiveness of sin, not courage, patience, or high-mindedness, all of which have earthly advantages and rewards, but meekness and turning the other cheek and forgiving one's enemies, a quality of character identified in the Gospel of Sufferings as the Christian's most specific mark, since it has no reward on earth and is unknown in paganism. The task of Christian faith in this context is not only to persevere in suffering, but also to believe against the understanding that it is beneficial in ridding oneself of egotism and selfishness in order to let God rule in everything, which constitutes the unconditional obedience of Christian character. In line with Augustine and Luther, Kierkegaard views selfishness as the only obstacle between a human being and God, inasmuch as in his view, quote, "There is nothing a human being hangs on to so firmly, indeed with his whole self, as to his selfishness. Moreover, it is only through your selfishness that the world has power over you. If you are dead to your selfishness, you are also dead to the world. Thus, the more suffering there is, the more all that is selfish is removed, rooted out, and the more obedience replaces it as the receptive soil in which the eternal can take root," end quote. Being goods of the Spirit, the Christian qualities of faith, hope, and love are inherently unselfish for Kierkegaard, inasmuch as they are essentially forms of communication to others, and thus a benefaction and blessing to all human beings, not just to the individual Christian who possesses them. To Kierkegaard, quote, "The whole generation and every individual in the generation is a participant in our having these qualities, since in having them we have only what every human being can have," end quote. In acquiring these spiritual goods for ourselves, therefore, we inherently enrich others as well. The essential character and pursuit of earthly or worldly goods, by contrast, is selfish and unjust, inasmuch as, quote, "they cannot be acquired or possessed equally," end quote. For what one person has, another cannot have, and the more one person has, the less there is for another. Even if we are willing to share our earthly goods with others, we are still selfish in spending time and energy acquiring and possessing them for ourselves. Conversely, goods of the Spirit cannot be possessed selfishly or just for oneself, and anyone who wants to possess them that way does not really possess them as Kierkegaard sees it. On the contrary, every moment spent acquiring and rejoicing in the possession of these goods is one in which Kierkegaard says, quote, "You are so far removed from being selfishly occupied with yourself that you are immediately communicating," end quote. Even less perfect spiritual goods, such as insight, knowledge, capacities, and gifts, are not communicative in themselves, but dependent on the character of the possessor, namely whether one is benevolent and communicating or selfish, since one can become selfishly enclosed in them in such a way as to transform them into earthly goods, which in one way or another make others poorer rather than richer. This distinction is further elaborated in works of love, where the qualities a person has are seen as being either for oneself or for others. Wisdom, power, talent, and knowledge, for example, are being for itself qualities, which are not presupposed in others, even though one may benefit others with them. For Kierkegaard, the virtues of paganism fall under this category, being for itself. Christian love, by contrast, is a quality by which or in which you are for others. Viewing all human love as having its mysterious origin and hidden ground in God, who is love itself, Kierkegaard understands Christian love to consist, first of all, in presupposing love in others. To love or to be for others thus means to build up love in them by presupposing and loving forth love in them. In seeking to build up love in others, however, Christian love may also be defined as a giving of oneself, or not seeking one's own in self-denial, which is, for Kierkegaard, is Christianity's most essential form. Christian love is the sacrificial giving of oneself completely and boundlessly to others without excluding anyone or demanding reciprocity in return. Quote, when a human being seeks another human being's love, seeks to be loved himself, this is not a giving of oneself, Kierkegaard contends, but simply an expression of self-love, selfishness, self-seeking, end quote, which Christianity also presupposes in every human being, but seeks to wrest away from us by commanding us to love the neighbor as ourselves. Properly understood, this commandment requires us to love ourselves in the right way, or as we ought to love ourselves, which is unselfishly, since otherwise we would not truly love the neighbor, but only a selfish projection of ourselves in the other. To love oneself in the right way and to love the neighbor thus correspond perfectly to one another. Fundamentally, they are one and the same thing, Kierkegaard says. Most essentially, however, to love the neighbor means to help another person to love God, and vice versa. To be loved by another person is to be helped to love God, who is the sole and only true object of human love. Only by loving God above all does one love the neighbor in the other human being, Kierkegaard claims. For to love people is to love God, and to love God is to love people. Love to God and love to neighbor are like two doors that open simultaneously, so that it is impossible to open one without opening the other, and impossible to shut one without also shutting the other. To love God also means to be like God, but we can only be like God by exercising an eternal equality and loving all persons without exception or personal preference on the basis of the eternal equality of all human beings before God, who makes no distinction between persons. Thus, God is, or should be, the middle term in every human relationship, the goal of which is to help each other learn to love rather than seek to be loved in and through our relations to one another. As Kierkegaard sees it, therefore, Christian love is not a separate type of love, but the spiritual transformation of our natural forms of love, so as to base them consciously upon the eternal in the duty to love ourselves and others, including beloveds, spouses, friends, parents, children, strangers, enemies, in short, everyone, first and foremost as neighbors, or in their fundamental category as human beings. Nor is Christian love merely an inward passion, but one that redoubles itself outwardly in works or fruits of love, so as to be, quote, sheer action, end quote. That is, it is what it does and does what it is. Christianity thus constitutes the true morality for Kierkegaard. For only when it is a duty to love others as neighbors is the moral task established, and love is made eternally secure against change and despair, so as to abide or have enduring continuance. Indeed, if one ceases to love, that is a sure indication to Kierkegaard that one has never been loving in the first place. The continuity of Christian love is established not by habit, which in Kierkegaard's view never becomes the unchanging no matter how firmly it is fixed, but by the eternal, which never grows old or becomes a habit. The essence of Christian character for Kierkegaard is thus, I think, to be found in Christian love, which manifests the inwardness, moral concern, unconditional obedience, continuity, service to the unconditioned, and infinite unity of being that are essential to becoming a person of character in Christianity. Indeed, as he sees it, quote, "To love people is the only thing worth living for, and without this love, you are not really living. It is also the only true sign that you are a Christian. Truly, a profession of faith is not enough," end quote. While it is possible to develop a Christian disposition to love, and thus to become more and more a Christian, Kierkegaard recognizes that a person would not be able to live exclusively at all times within the highest Christian conceptions any more than he or she could live only on the food at the communion table. Moreover, the more one succeeds in developing such a disposition, the worse it will go for one in the world, which has only a sagacious understanding of self-denial and love, in the expectation of esteem, honor, and reciprocity in return. Thus, the Christian inevitably faces double danger, both internally and externally, in striving to express Christian love to others. Although the road of perfection is one of continual hardship and suffering, Kierkegaard nevertheless regards it as passable and practical, not superhuman, even if no human being ever reaches it. The more one suffers, the closer to perfection one comes, inasmuch as true perfection is to be tried daily in the actuality of suffering, which is hard, rare, and exhausting, but for that very reason, true perfection. At other times, however, Kierkegaard is less optimistic about the possibility of progress, viewing Christian perfection not as a progressive movement forward, but a retrogressive step backward in the increasing discovery of the perfection of the ideal and our greater distance from it, in the deep recognition of the imperfection of all of our striving, and thus a deeper and deeper consciousness of our need for grace, both before and after striving to follow Christ. Christianly, he says, the emphasis does not fall so much upon to what extent or how far a person succeeds in meeting or fulfilling the requirement if he actually is striving, as it is upon his getting an impression of the requirement in all of its infinitude, so that he rightly learns to be humbled and to rely upon grace. From this lengthy discourse on becoming, I hope you're awake still, from this lengthy discourse on becoming a person of character in Kierkegaard's thought, several conclusions may now be ventured. First of all, character, like selfhood, is not a given or natural condition of human beings. Neither is it autonomously constructed or the product of biological dispositions, social forces, or parental teachings, although these influences certainly play a role in shaping the kind of persons we become in life. Rather, human character is formed via a relation to God, and more specifically in Christianity, via a relation to God in Christ, who not only atones for human sin by his death, but also constitutes the qualitative criterion and ethical goal for human selfhood, which is always in the process of being realized due to its infinite character and the continuation of sin in our lives. Second, while character in general consists in inwardness and morality for Kierkegaard, Christian character, more specifically, is composed of positive qualities such as faith, hope, love, and joy, but in accordance with the inverse dialectic that governs everything Christian, they are expressed and recognized through negative qualifications that are also essential to becoming a Christian, namely the consciousness of sin, the possibility of offense, lowliness, meekness, and dying to selfishness and worldliness in self-denial and suffering in likeness to Christ. Third, the fact that Kierkegaard does not employ the language of virtue in delineating character suggests that he does not equate it with virtue, which he associates with sagacity and selfish or being for oneself qualities acquired and or perfected by human agency. The spiritual qualities that distinguish ethical, religious, and Christian character, by contrast, are given by God, appropriated in freedom, and possessed unselfishly. Fourth, Kierkegaard's reluctance to use the language of virtue sets him apart not only from the classical virtue tradition, but also from medieval scholasticism, with its notion of infused virtues as habits that enable one to merit salvation through a supernatural enhancement of one's natural capabilities. It would therefore, I think, be more appropriate to call Kierkegaard a character ethicist than a virtue ethicist, distinguishing between the two as some contemporary moral psychologists do, and characterizing his views in his own terms rather than via concepts and/or traditions foreign to the historical context and theological structure of his thought, thereby misconstruing it. Fifth, although deeply influenced by the late medieval Catholic devotional writings on the imitation of Christ, Kierkegaard understands Christian discipleship in accordance with the German Lutheran tradition of Nachfolge, that is, not as a way of achieving merit and holiness or perfection in, by, and for oneself, but of striving to follow Christ by identifying with him and his love in self-denial and suffering. Kierkegaard thus stands with Luther in affirming Christ as both gift and example. By the atonement for and forgiveness of sin, we are able to put on Christ, first by appropriating his merit for salvation through faith or grace alone, and then by seeking to represent or be like him in striving to express unconditional obedience and love to God through Christian love for others as the glad fruit of faith. By identifying with Christ and his love in our daily lives, we are able to live more and more out of ourselves and thus more truly to become ourselves as persons of character. Finally, with respect to becoming a person of character in the present age, Kierkegaard was quite aware that times are different and different times have different requirements. That is why he felt the need to stress the imitation of Christ over against the secular mentality of his time, which in his view had taken Luther's message of salvation by faith alone in vain by wanting to become Christian as cheaply as possible. Yet Kierkegaard adamantly insisted that Christianity cannot be changed, inasmuch as, quote, from the very beginning it has wanted and wants to be presented unaltered in all its unconditionality, end quote, regardless of whether anyone accepts it or not. While differing from Kierkegaard's time in many ways, our time has seen an increase in social leveling and a corresponding further decline in religious belief and practice, resulting in massive secularization and the creation of what philosopher Charles Taylor has aptly described as a closed or immanent social and moral order dedicated to the pursuit of human happiness and individual flourishing without any sense of the presence or transcendence of the divine. The rise of religious pluralism, evangelical megachurches, and new forms of spirituality attest to a continuing interest in institutional forms of religion, as well as privatized subjective expressions of belief in a transcendent reality, and the need for some kind of personal transformation and higher fulfillment than gainful employment, reasonable prosperity, consumer choice, and exciting media. For the most part, however, the religiosity of our time still reflects the feel-good, undemanding spirituality so severely criticized by Kierkegaard in his time. While persons are encouraged to do their own thing in the present age, the self-cultivation of character it supports is nevertheless socially conformist, superficial, narrowly focused on one's own self-interest and a self-aggrandizement, not the other directed inwardness and outwardness of Christian love. Our prototypes for self-development or sports heroes, entertainment stars, Lady Gaga, for example, gun-toting Rambos, and corporate CEOs, not Jesus of Nazareth. We are sympathetic toward others, especially in times of crisis, but only to a certain degree. Violence plagues our cities, schools, and homes, while corporate and personal greed and the discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, the affluent versus the millions of people below the poverty line, grow worse in our country and around the world. From a Kierkegaardian standpoint, however, the way to counteract the lack of character in our time is not by compromising or changing the Christian gospel in order to make it more appealing to secular society, or by reviving an elusive personal ethic of virtue, but by striving in faith and imitation of Christ to obey the Christian command to love our neighbors as ourselves. This is undoubtedly a radical social ethic that few in our time will have the courage to embrace, involving as it does voluntary self-denial and inevitable suffering on the part of Christian strivers. As Kierkegaard so presciently points out, quote, "Rarely indeed will it be the case in our day that a person truthfully dares to say that he suffers for Christ's sake. But even though this were to become a greater rarity, it nevertheless can happen, often, and it can happen to every human being," end quote. In laying bare, in an uncompromising manner, the unconditional character of the Christian gospel, and in challenging us as single individuals to become persons of character in the strictest sense by believing in and following Jesus Christ, Kierkegaard is not only a Christian thinker for our time, but hopefully for many ages to come. Thank you.
We have a few minutes. We have microphones on either side if you'd like to step forward and ask a couple questions.
I know I've stepped on some toes here, so come on up.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Yes.
Something that puzzles me about the idea that the opposite of sin is not virtue but faith. What puzzles me is that faith is one of the theological virtues.
In the Catholic tradition, yes.
Yes, and which
Kierkegaard is a Lutheran.
Well, I mean, one can understand the sickness unto death as depicting sin and despair with the diagnosis, with therapy of being faith and hope, and then he obviously wrote the works of love. So he's talking about faith, hope, and love.
Yes, he is.
Which seems to me to be a way of elucidating the theological virtues.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure there are many people who do consider faith, hope, and love as theological virtues, and they were identified as such in medieval scholasticism. But my point is that Kierkegaard does not consider them to be virtues because he has, I think, a particular idea or understanding of what a virtue is. And he associates virtue most of all with something that we achieve on our own. And that is why I think he consciously refrains from using virtue terminology in relation to spiritual goods. He does not use this term, even in the later Christian writings. I mentioned, the 18 upbuilding discourses where he does not call all those qualities virtues. But in the later writings as well, he refers to them as spiritual goods or spiritual qualities. He does not call them virtues. And I think he does that consciously, so as not to misrepresent what is involved in acquiring faith, hope, and love, which is as gifts. In other words, I think in the background for him is not only classical paganism, but also the medieval scholastic tradition. Yes?
Interestingly, my question was very similar to the first man's question, and so maybe just a follow-up on that. If we can grant that the theological virtues for someone like Aquinas indeed do not involve my activity and are not acquired through habit, but through infusion, granting that Kierkegaard has perhaps a literary or a rhetorical interest in avoiding the V word. Is it simply a difference in terminology? Is what you're describing something that Aquinas would be happy to call the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity?
Well, Aquinas certainly does call them theological virtues. And I'm not an Aquinas scholar, so I may be wrong here, but doesn't the medieval scholastic tradition, including Aquinas, understand the gift, grace that is given in faith, hope, and love as somehow enhancing our natural abilities so that one then comes to merit salvation in a sense on one's own, or
I mean,
so it's an enhancement of our natural abilities. Kierkegaard wants to say the first thing that you come to know before God is that you have no merit whatsoever, no matter how many good works you do.
Yeah, I mean, you're certainly right that it does involve an enhancing of our ability. You know, faith is to be able to believe what my intellect could not lead me to believe. Hope is to see something possible that I could not have seen was possible. Love, to be able to realize a union that would not have been possible. And yet each of those three things seems to be something that even with our admission of guilt and our unworthiness, that on the Kierkegaardian picture that you have drawn seems to be part of the story of what could be pursued by a Kierkegaardian person of character.
Well, I think it has to do mainly with a matter of how one understands human activity in this process. As he understands it, even though we are active, we're not passive in the sense that we do nothing. Yeah. Even though we are active, when we love others, we are loving through the grace of God, or Christ who dwells within us, helping us to love God, to love the neighbor.
Yeah. And so I hope that there might be a reconciliation there. I don't think Thomas would say that we gain something or merit something or become, get something that we deserve in faith, hope, and love. So maybe there's more reconciliation. Well,
maybe Thomas not, but certainly in the medieval scholastic tradition, there was a strong sense of being able to merit salvation through various acts that one could do. Yeah.
Thanks for a marvelous paper. I'm interested in the last year of his life, of Kierkegaard's life. Certainly one can interpret what he did in his attack as having character and laying down his life for the community and so on. Would you say that there are some ways in which that attack lacked character?
Well, I think Kierkegaard might feel that he himself, maybe for the first time, was able to step out in character, to witness for Christianity and Christ in a way in which he had not perhaps had the courage to do earlier. I'm not sure why you might think it would exemplify a lack of character unless you understand it as being his attack as not being an expression of love, but an expression of hatred. I think he would see it as, trying to clear the decks so that people could truly act as Christians in the world.
Well, psychologists often think of our character as ambivalent or having mixed motives, and so one could interpret that there being multiple reasons why he did what he did.
That's entirely possible.
At an unconscious
because
level.
Kierkegaard also understood that he was a sinner too, and he failed just as much as we do. I think. I mean, Thank you. Here comes Mark.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Yep.
It's a great paper.
Thank you.
As you know, I'm sympathetic to the first two people, what they said.
Right.
A theological virtue for Aquinas sounds very reformed. It's something, a quality, a spiritual quality given by God, revealed by God, and its object is God. That sounds good for Luther and Calvin, it seems to me. What I heard you say in your response to the second person had to do with salvation. I hadn't heard you talk about salvation during the talk. So I wonder...
that's not Kierkegaard's.
So this is what I wonder. Mm-hmm. Could we make room, not for Aristotelian virtue talk, but for the kind of virtue talk I just mentioned, not as unto salvation, but as a sanctification process, so that those who are saved in Christ or by Christ through faith then possess something that is given by God and is revealed by God, and its object is God.
Mm-hmm. Why do you want to call it a virtue?
Nothing hinges on it to me to call it a virtue, but
so
I guess
why must we use that language, especially if you are expositing Kierkegaard? Why do you start calling all of these things virtues? Sure. Because he doesn't.
Yeah, I think it's in the same spirit as the other person, which is to try to find some affinity in church history, beyond more ecumenical than just say Luther. I mean, I think that's so. Thank you.
Well, I also thought that was a very lovely paper and beautifully worked out. I guess I do want to say I don't think we should argue mainly about the language. I mean, I think you made your points very well, of the dangers of using virtue language, the way it can be misleading. And I think it might be fine to say, well, let's do something different. Let's talk about an ethic of character. But I do think that even if we change the language, we should also be sensitive to the possibility of misleading us with respect to continuities that there may be between Kierkegaard and Aquinas and some of the other great thinkers. After all, he sees himself, I think, as carrying on what we might call the great tradition, not as presenting something radically new that he invented himself.
Oh, that's true.
It's just Christianity, right?
Right.
So the continuities are there, too. And someone like Aquinas, it seems to me, does, when properly understood, as opposed to a lot of the kind of, I think there are a lot of debased kind of versions of Thomism around as well. I think there's much more continuity there than one might think. And with respect to the question of whether or not faith, hope, and love are enhancements of our natural capacities, let me just say, obviously, not just in the sense that they're bigger or better or somehow quantitatively changed, but qualitatively changed. There's a very important passage in Works of Love where Kierkegaard says, there is nothing new in Christianity in the sense that it has not been present in the world before, and yet everything is new. And I think there you have both continuity and discontinuity. Yes, love is there, and in one sense, Christianity is an enhancement of love, but it's not a mere, you might say, development of natural love. It's an enhancement which qualitatively transforms and changes everything. So there's both continuity and discontinuity.
Well, if you want to use enhancement in that sense, yes, definitely a transformation takes place, which doesn't just enhance our natural potentialities, but I think redirects them. It fundamentally changes us, or in the direction of, instead of being self-centered, to be able to take others into consideration more than we naturally would do. Merrill?
I'd like to continue by making a strategic argument in favor of talking about Kierkegaard as a virtue ethicist. If one asks what Aquinas does, he takes a classical Aristotelian theory where virtues are things we produce within ourselves by ourselves, and with his notion of infusion, gives a specifically Christian context for thinking about the virtues. There are virtues which we do not produce by ourselves, but only by the grace of God, who implants them within us and allows us to develop them once they are planted within us. And Eleanor Stump has called my attention to the fact that the three theological virtues in Aquinas are not the only infused virtues, but there's a spilling over of this concept to infect the whole of virtue theory in Aquinas. So that what Aquinas does is insert a distinctively Christian voice into a pagan discourse and say there are Christian ways of thinking about this that have, as Steve just suggested, a certain continuity, but a very important, crucial discontinuity. Well, it seems to me that Kierkegaard might be put in the same situation, insofar as virtue ethics discourse is one of the important language games going on within the philosophical profession. If one discusses Kierkegaard as a virtue ethicist, calling attention as you do to the fact that he doesn't use that language, but that he can be read as providing a distinctly Christian account of those moral excellences that are elsewhere called virtues, that would be a way of inserting him into a conversation from which he would otherwise be excluded and from which there are already too few distinctively Christian voices. That's the strategic consideration, and it seems to me that it could be made while fully acknowledging the importance of your point as to the fact that he doesn't himself use that language.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm a bit concerned that by trying so hard to put Kierkegaard, on the one hand, into the secular virtue ethics tradition, and on the other hand, associating him with, particularly with Aquinas, that, you know, Kierkegaard sort of loses his true identity here. He's not a Catholic. And there are, I think, some structural differences between Protestantism and Catholicism, although certainly there are important continuities, as Steve and Merrill has pointed out here. So my point is that when we do talk about Kierkegaard, if we're talking about his views in relation to other traditions, I think we need to be careful that we construe him in his own terms and point out not only the way in which he is similar to other traditions, but also how he differs from them and why he is different from them. I mean, has the Catholic tradition left its medieval background of meriting salvation, for example? Other questions? Oh, yeah, Anthony.
Couple of observations there.
Yeah.
Firstly, it seems that one could accept everything you say and still think that Kierkegaard makes an important contribution to virtue ethics, just in that the ethical, Judge William, that whole discussion, this is something that is not his ultimate view, and you can say, okay, he leaves that behind.
Right.
Nonetheless, it's something important. He has a lot to say about that, and one could simply think of him as contributing to a virtue understanding of the ethical stage while setting aside the religious. That's just the first observation. Second point, though, is certainly in Kierkegaard there is this big emphasis on we have no merit and, the central role of grace. But there is also a great emphasis, of course, on the existential, the needing to think of oneself as engaged in living this life and striving to live better. And it seems that there can seem a contradiction here. I'm thinking actually of a suggestion made by Lee Barrett in a very excellent essay in the International Kierkegaard Commentary, actually, I think the volume on philosophical fragments, where he's suggesting that for Kierkegaard we don't, try to weigh out, well, exactly how much is due to grace and how much is free will.
Right,
and,
it depends on the context.
Juggling these amounts, but it's totally grace and it's also totally free will. I mean, we have to think of ourselves as, I am striving to become, you mentioned a whole slew of what would normally be taken as virtues, honesty, love,
right.
Selflessness, humility, meekness, etc., etc. And from my own perspective, as a moral agent, I've got to think of myself as, I need to try to become more honest with myself or whatever this is. And so from my perspective, I can't help thinking of this is something I am having to strive towards. Yeah. And that does seem to put him into closer relationship with, classical philosophical theories of the virtues.
Well, he certainly is not against personal striving. But, if you look at his work in the context of the whole authorship, in the postscript, he wants us to understand that finally striving on our own is not going to enable us to conform our lives with the good. And that's why we need then to turn to grace in Christianity. So there's a certain, yes, human beings are always to strive. Striving, I think the striving element becomes stronger in Kierkegaard from the postscript on, and certainly in Christianity, the striving, but one doesn't do it on one's own. One can't do it on one's own, as he sees it. But Anthony, referring to Judge William, I think, is probably a virtue ethicist. At least he does affirm the personal, the civic, and the religious virtues. He's one of the few, the only pseudonym, I think, that speaks positively about virtue and that we develop from personal and civic and religious virtues. But I would not equate Judge William's views with Kierkegaard's.
Sylvia, thank you. Let's grant for a moment the negative point, and to move forward a little bit, that Kierkegaard doesn't do virtue ethics. Could you say a little more then why you characterize this as character ethics? Because it's not like Jesus says, go and be good characters. And so why would you call it character ethics as opposed to maybe something else that Kierkegaard would have used, terminology he would have used?
Because character is a term that he does use, and he uses it quite a bit in the late journals. And so, and in terms of the way in which he understands Christian character. So it seems to me that if we want to talk about him as an ethicist, then it's more appropriate than to call him a character ethicist, which is using the terminology and the concepts that he himself uses and understands, than to use some other.
Hello, thanks too for a great paper. So changing the topic just a little bit from virtue itself to the call to love.
Yeah.
I heard you say that we are called to love others, not so much to be loved, particularly in the context in which you talked about the love of God and love of neighbor being a unified act. So I was wondering at the same time whether when Kierkegaard talks about loving another person as a means of helping that person to love God and kind of loving forth in that way, isn't there a way to read an implication that there is a need to be loved by others so as to be helped to love God? Yeah. And further, Kierkegaard himself gives the example in Works of Love that Jesus, whom we are called to imitate, had that love story with Peter going on. Yeah. Please tell me again that you love me, and so on. So I wonder whether, to what extent you see in Kierkegaard resources to affirm that we are also creatures of need who need to be loved. So
I agree.
Wonder.
Yes, you're exactly right. We do need to be loved. I think Kierkegaard handles it in Works of Love through another concept, and that's the concept of redoubling. You love another person. You don't love another person consciously in terms of Christian love. You're not loving the other person with the requirement that you be loved in return. Erotic love does that well enough just on its own, right? You know, you fall in love with somebody. If the love isn't returned, the relationship falls apart, and you go and you look for somebody else. But when you're trying to express Christian love to others, you do something for the other. You do it without demanding that they return the love. Okay, just that far. So it's done without reciprocity, without any demand for return. But there is a concept in works of love called redoubling, which means that what you give, you in fact receive in return from God. If in order to be forgiven, we are forgiven when we forgive. Our forgiveness is our forgiveness. And I think he sees the love in this way. If we love others in a loving, Christianly manner, then we do need love, and we will receive love, at least from God, if not from the other.
Right, if I may, just a very brief addendum with respect to situating him not so much in the Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics is perhaps a way to align him more with Plato, whose idea of love involves resource and need. So therefore, coming from that angle, I thought that there might be a continuity.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Got time for just maybe two very short questions.
Okay.
Up against the clock.
Okay.
Actually, my question follows very nicely from the last one. Perhaps in seeking a continuity, we might look for a type of Kierkegaard, not necessarily identical, in Augustine, which would make him much more Lutheran, in the City of God. Mm-hmm. Because in the City of God, Augustine takes both Aristotle's concept of God as final cause and good, but also God, the Augustinian good that is loved and desired, and not just some sort of final good. And in that case, he engages Augustine engages the discourse of, say, the Stoics, who try to find happiness in this life, try to be virtuous in this life by being content with whatever good there can be, but they desire too little. And so, in a way, Kierkegaard might be, his concept of the good is engaging in the virtue discourse, but in the transformed way that Augustine brings forth in the City of God, rather than Aquinas by returning back to this notion of development and putting the emphasis more upon relationship. Mm-hmm. Would that be a better comparison?
I don't know. Of course, it is in the City of God that Augustine critiques the classical pagan virtue and calls them the glittering vices. Mm-hmm. But if I understand what you're saying correctly here, it's that Augustine, through eros, has a desire or longing for the good, for God. And I don't see that Kierkegaard need to deny that at all.
It's just that virtue is directed towards some good. At the beginning of the Ethics, all virtues are aimed at some end. Mm-hmm. But that end has to Augustine places it not in some human telos, but in God. And because it's God, it's a person. It's not just a form of human good. Mm-hmm.
Well, if one is acting virtuously, you're suggesting then if it's for the end of the good or the end of for God, then it's not what? Selfish? It's not.
I don't understand. Why
I don't know. I don't think I understand what you're asking either.
Okay. I'll let all of the other
Okay.
person ask
Okay.
questions.
Thanks. I'm very sympathetic to your take on Kierkegaard and the Catholic tradition. There's one word that Mark Teachin, wherever he sat down to, had used in a paper of his that despite my sympathies with your position, I can't quite get out of my head, and it's a word I didn't hear you unpack since the talk, and that's disposition. Can you say a little bit more about how you see disposition in your character reading of Kierkegaard?
Well, Kierkegaard uses the word disposition several times, the concept of anxiety, and also, in particular, I used it today from Works of Love, where he does say that, we can develop a disposition to love. I take it that would be more and more an inward inclination to love. And I think you want me to say the word habit there. But he does not like that word. Okay.
Join me in thanking Sylvia Walsh.